What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Lambo here, and today I want to talk with you about some concerns that I'm seeing resurface all the time throughout the community, and some hot takes, if you will, that are regarding Protoss. And in case you're wondering why my face is so red, it's because I was in the shower for too long. Either way, let's get straight to the first one. Something that I see over and over again is that the reason Protoss performs well on the ladder and really bad later on into the tournaments is because it's a gambling race. Protoss players have to gamble. They have to play tricky in order to win. They cannot play straight up. That's why in best of ones they're good. Since ladder is just best of ones, right? And then in tournaments, whenever the series start to become best of fives or best of sevens, and also throughout just the tournament procedures, they have to show their strategies, and then in the later rounds they're figured out, and then they can be blind countered. And since they have to rely on gambles, that's why Protoss is not winning tournaments, but they're doing well on ladder. And so to go over that a bit, the first thing that I want to talk about is I don't know where people are getting it from that Protoss are doing better on the ladder than they are doing in tournaments, because Protoss is doing just as well in tournaments as they're doing on the ladder. Basically, every pro gamer performs as well in tournaments as they're doing on ladder over time. It's just always the case. The best players, which is usually what people complain about when they talk about Protoss underperforming, are or have been always on the Korean server. It's always Maru, who is the highest MMR almost always, and in Europe it has always been Sarah, and nowadays it's also Clem and Max Specs, and then the rest of the top players, right? Where in Korea below Maru, you'll find Darek, Hero, and so on. And in Europe, below Cyril, usually you would find Renner and Clem. Nowadays, it's also Max Specs. So below that, like if you're looking past the top maybe 10 players, and you look at the rest of the pro players, even in tournaments, you will see that a huge portion of those players are Protoss, and it holds true for ladder as well. So I think a reason why people think that Protoss is doing better on the ladder is because a lot of these top players are either leaving league or not playing enough ladder games, quite frankly. So that if they're looking at the top of the ladder in Europe at any given time, they're gonna see like 12 Protosses in the top 16. But that's because like I'm not playing ladder, Elazer is not playing ladder, um, Sarah's not playing enough ladder games, Rainer's not playing enough ladder games, etc., etc. But overall, if you just look at the MMR of each player, they're doing just as well on the ladder as they are doing in tournaments. And I'm pretty sure if you're referencing a League scores or tournament results after the top 8, there's going to be way more Protoss players than Tyrants and Zergs. And the reason for that, why there's more Protoss players in GM and also in the tournaments overall, after the first couple of ranks, is that Protoss is easier to play. I think this is not even controversial, and this is just the way it is. Protoss is easier to play. I can tell you from my own experience, since I offer quite a bit with Protoss and Terran, I can get the same MMR with Protoss while putting in 1/6 of the effort, and without really learning proper build orders. So it's relatively easy with Protoss to get decent. It's not easy at all to get very, very good with Protoss, but it's easier to get decent, and that's the level that is required to qualify for those tournaments or go to the events and then finish in the top 32, or likewise to get Grandmaster ladder. So that's the reason why we see this, not because Protoss has to gamble. And then I want to talk about this specific standpoint from Protoss. Protoss is having to gamble. I think the most successful Protosses have shown that right now you can play absolutely solid and standard. They follow a very, very well thought out game plan that they can reproduce practically every game they play. Obviously, you can mix it up, and you should mix it up in tournaments, and every race does this. Cyril also mixes it up, even though he can play normal macro games. But for example, in PvZ, Hero, which I think he is the best PvZ player, plays Stalker into Storm, into Tempest, just plays standard, solid macro games almost every game. And then the best PvP player and PvT player in the world, which is Max Specs, also has like 3 or 4 build orders that he cycles through consistently. And he plays very, very straight up and solid. You can outplay your opponents as Protoss and play a normal macro game. You do not have to gamble. I understand that SOS, for example, was really good, and there were a lot of creative Protoss players that used a wide range of build orders instead of just trying to out multitask their opponents and take them head on in a normal game, but this is just not the case. Most Protoss players, actually, on the ladder as well, are just playing standard. A lot of them have the differences and styles. There's a lot of stylistic Protosses, but they play the same stuff over and over again, even in these best of ones in the ladder. I mean, they're not actually doing better in the ladder than they're doing in tournaments to begin with, which is my entire point. But this is not even true. Even in the best of ones where they presumably are doing well, they're just playing normal as well. Like most Protoss players can play standard and solid and macro, and they do not need to gamble every game. I think this is not true for the current patch, for the current meta, and I think it is um, apparent that this is the case if you look at the games and the way the best Protoss players in the world are playing the game. Now, for the second concern that I see all the time, or the second hot take, honestly, these are not really hot takes since they're being parroted all over the place, so they're maybe lukewarm at best, is that the skill ceiling is too low for Protoss. So I think a lot of people agree that it might be easier to get good with Protoss, which is just the way it is. But then they're saying the skill floor is high, but the skill ceiling is too low. So there's not a lot of room for skill expression. And this one is the most triggering one for me personally, because I am watching the tournaments where Protosses are losing and the best players are losing because they're making a lot of mistakes, just like every other the best players of the other races are also. That's the reason everybody loses games in Starcraft, is because they're making mistakes. But if the race was so easy to play, they wouldn't be making those mistakes. And also saying that there is no room for extra skill expression is just idiotic when I see how much there is that they can still improve upon, and also how much there is that the Protoss race allows you to do. So let me take ZVP again as an example. I think not a single Protoss, also not a single Zerg for that fact, is even close to playing the perfect late game, because it is impossibly hard to do. You need a ton of hotkeys. The amount of times where I see the mothership being abducted because it's on follow command is insane, because they're running out of hotkeys. You need a lot of hotkeys as Protoss, and preferably you would need to be using them perfectly, but that's really, really difficult. And I don't think there's a single player that can do all of that. So, for example, you should have a hotkey for the oracles to constantly revelate. You don't see a single Protoss perfectly using their oracles in late game, ever, even though it's like the most broken ability is revelation in late game, because you can constantly track what your opponent's army is doing, where they're at, and then you can abuse the range for the Tempest. Tempest should be on a separate hotkey, which a lot of Protoss players do have, but then usually they have to take some of the other units away from a single hotkey. So you should have, as I said, the Mothership, the Oracles, the Tempest on a separate hotkey. You should have the High Templars on a separate hotkey, which then a lot of them don't have. They have to click their High Templars separately forward, because there's a dance between Tempest and Vipers, where the Tempest can constantly shoot, and then the moment the Vipers come in, you can feedback if the High Templar stands on top of the Tempest. But for that to happen, and you also don't want all of your High Templars to be forward, because otherwise they can get fungled, and the Zerg might be able to engage upon them with Broodlords or Ultralisks or Lurkers. Like that's a micro war consistently, so preferably you would have an extra hotkey for that, right? And then you need a hotkey for your ground army, and then you should always have your ground army split to a certain degree. So you need either a run by or a run by defense. That should also be on an extra hotkey. How often do we see the best Protoss players in the world run buying 10 zealots, and then they're not paying attention, so the zealots just die to a bunch of marines, right? That's 10 zealots, that's 1k resources. That's an insane amount of units that you just lost because you're not perfectly paying attention. The amount of times where Protoss can go forward, this is what you see with Max Specs nowadays, is that he constantly pokes forward with the Stalkers, even in mid game, to try and find 1 or 2 unit kills. You can do that the entire way through. The amount of times we see Protoss players blinking all of their Stalkers at once, the later the game goes, this just increases over time, where they can still improve. The skill ceiling is actually very high for Protoss. It's very high. The race is hard to play on the highest level. It is extremely hard to play. It is maybe easier to get good with. So I agree that this is the fact, this is the case, but the skill ceiling is not too low. There is so much room for skill expression, and people are still improving. You can see this mostly with Max Specs, who's improving obviously at the quickest rate, since he's the youngest player at the highest level. But players are still improving, and I think there is enough room for skill expression for Protoss. I'm always up to change the game in a way where you allow even more skill expression and more microable units. I think that's always a good thing. But I hate that people are pretending like Protoss is so easy to play on the absolute highest level and there's nothing they can do better, because that is just not the case. If they're playing better, they would also be getting better results, and there's still room for improvement there. So I don't think the skill ceiling is as low as people make it out to be. Oh, another anecdote that I have, by the way. Um, Another anecdote that I have for this, by the way, is that I used to practice with Archon mode against Drainer in preparation for his Katowice or so, and usually we would play Terran, and the games would be really hard, and in 2v1, most of the time Rainer would lose, but he still would have a chance. And to be honest with you guys, if we played 2v1 against Rainer, very often Clem would still be better in terms of micro, etc. But these games would be really hard, but not impossible. So that's the perfect type of practice that you want as a pro gamer. You would want a challenge that doesn't feel impossible. And then I tried playing 2v1 once with Harstem, where I only told Harstem what I want him to play, the build order. He only macros, and I only micro. I'm the only one that's executing the build order um, offensively. So I think we played Oracles, just normal Oracles, and then Adapts, and then into Blink Stalkers. And it was clear from the get go that this was impossible. It was impossible for him to win or do anything because I could just consistently micro the stalkers the entire time, blink one by one, and just take the trades were just out of this world. And there was not much he could do to punish it. Because whenever he would try a run by, then Harstem could just focus on the defense. And if Protoss players would play this perfectly, which we still didn't play anywhere close to perfect, but even though this is obviously unrealistic, there was no chance for him, absolutely none. So we stopped doing that right away. Whereas for the Terran practice, we still do this quite often. And then there's other things that got to my mind right now as well, like always using sentries, always using Guardian Shield before the fight. A lot of players stop using sentries the later the game goes. Even in late game scenarios, you should theoretically have it because Guardian Shield is insane. But the list goes on and on. There's skill ceiling is pretty high for Protoss. I think you got my point. Let's go on to the next one. Okay, the next one is that Toss is simply too punishing. If Toss makes a single mistake, they're dead. And the other races, whenever they make mistakes, they're fine. They can still play the game. They just have another life and then another life and then another life. And I felt like, especially before the last patch, where they nerfed specifically the Raven pushes plus the Widow Mines. I think this probably was true to a certain extent against Terran, where, for example, they come in with a Hellion drop and then you feel like, or with a Widowmine drop, and if you don't defend properly, you're dead to the tank push. And then if you make a mistake against the tank push, you feel like you're dead. And then if you hold everything well, then well, Terran just gets to play a mid game, and this is what it feels like being on the defensive end. But trust me, this is how it feels like playing Zerg all the time. If I'm out of position with my queens against the very first Oracle and I lose 5 drones, and I'm playing against Max Fixer Hero, the game's over. It is over. I cannot come back from that. It's a snowball. Maybe I'll die like 5 minutes later, but I'm pretty dead at that point. Um, Likewise, I think every race has this to a certain extent, where you feel like you can only make a single mistake, but it depends what type of mistake it is. Not every mistake is the same. So let me give you another example here. If I'm playing a ZVT against a Terran, and I'm not looking at the minimap, so I'm slightly out of position with my queens. The Hellions run in, they kill an entire mineral line. I'm now down 20 workers, right? I still stay in the game because sometimes you can come back. And indeed, I start rolling back. The Terran makes some mistakes. He doesn't pay attention to his first 2 medevacs worth of units, so he loses a couple of Marines. He loses some SCVs against the run by. I don't know, maybe he loses another medevac somewhere that he just rallied over the queens. And then 2 minutes later, I die anyways to an Atrax. So it feels like you played better and you just made a single mistake and you couldn't afford it. And the other guy could make multiple mistakes. But that's how mistakes in StarCraft work, is the severity of the mistakes and when they happen. That should change the game, and not every mistake is worth the same. I want you to believe me that every race in StarCraft at the highest level has it where if they make one mistake, could just even be a supply block. Like if I'm supply blocked as I see the glaives move out, and this happened to me so many times, you're dead. Like you're dead. It's there's not much you can do. That's just a supply block, but that's a game losing error. Zerg has this, Terran has this as well. If they just miss a scout on a certain all in, they can die, for example. Not against Zerg, because Zerg doesn't have all ins against Terran, but in TVT. I'm mostly joking, obviously. I think every race has this where, for example, as a Terran, you don't pay attention, you eat a massive storm, the game's over on the highest level. It is just how it is. That's how cutthroat Starcraft is on the highest level, where with every race you can make a mistake and you're dead. So I don't like that. I think people are overblowing this. I think you can get this sense that a race is too punishing, and it mostly happens whenever a race is on the defensive end. So, for example, if I'm playing ZVP and I'm playing lurkers, and I'm sitting in my base trying to defend, right? I just tagged up to lurkers. Usually you lose map control when you do that. Um, and my opponent is doing like a Stalker Colossus or something, let's say. So he 100% has the map control. My lurkers are just out. And I just do not have the lurkers pre-sieged. He's already on the edge of creep, so he denied some creep, and my lurkers are in front of my bases. And now I'm out of position just once, and he runs towards my natural ramp. Let's say I'm on side delta, and I'm set up at my third base. He pokes there. He goes around, and I'm not quick enough to keep a concave of lurkers. So now he stands in between my natural and third base. That game is over. Like there's very very little I can do. I now have to run into him with lurkers, which just usually doesn't work because I will lose half my lurkers beforehand, and he can just kite towards my natural, kill off all my reinforcements there. Most of the time, my lurkers won't even get to shoot. I then have to unburrow, run at his army again. The same stuff happens. He kites towards my main base. I'm dead most of the time. I died like this many, many times. It feels like even if you played a game, a good game beforehand, then you make one mistake, you're dead, and that feels really, 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 really annoying. Especially if you feel like your opponent also made mistakes. Those are game-losing mistakes. Those are not the same. If my opponent in the early game lost an Oracle, that's really bad, and that has implications on the outcome of the game. Or if he traded into a depths where he just didn't look, I'm feeling like, okay, my opponent is not on point, and he made those mistakes. And I check the replay and I see his supply blocked as well. Doesn't matter in the end if he does the Colossus push and I'm out of position completely for it. In the end, then I still deserve the loss. If you take one bad engagement in late game and you lose an army, most of the time you're dead with any race. That is just how the game works. So I think this um, notion that Protoss is the only race that can lose with a single mistake, and that it happens way too often with that race, is also a bit overblown. With all that being said, I still think it's completely fine to let your concerns be heard. In general, it's always good to let your voice be heard if you think there's something wrong. Just tell them it's just these three claims that in particular have I mean, usually I'm smiling over them, but I just wanted to talk about them. There's also one that whenever a Zerg wins, there's always the people that are going to say, you can never balance Zerg. They'll always be too strong because of their remax mechanic. And I'm just looking at it and I'm like, what? Like, if you just keep nerfing the Zerg units, obviously they're going to be not, not the best race. They're going to be, in fact, the worst race. Either way, um, these types of claims, I think, are a little bit pointless most of the time and not very constructive. Um, I know it's very hot and in right now to go on the side of Protoss and say, man, Protoss is way too weak. I'm not even talking about this patch, but just in general. I know that that's the trend that we're seeing, and that's fine if you think that. I think personally, I am quite certain that Protoss is not too weak against Zerg, and I think most Protosses will agree with that. Pretty sure every Zerg will agree with that. But you could say the Zergs are biased, so ask the Protoss players. I also don't think that Protoss players are gonna tell you, the professional players, that their race is so garbage as everybody makes it out to be. If it's too weak, it's not by as much as people make it out to be. It is not a non-viable race. Like, this type of stuff is so stupid, and if it's being parroted all over the place, it just leads to more people reading it and seeing it, and they're, yeah, Protoss has no chance. And I'm not advertising for, if you think something is wrong, it's so obvious that Protoss is so weak. You just want everybody to be quiet about it and happy about it, but that's not the case. I think it is actually just not as weak as people think. But I wanted to make this video specifically about those things. If you want my true takes on balance and the patch notes in particular, let me know below in the comments. I might make a video if it's requested once the actual patch notes, the final patch notes are here. I don't know how final the notes that we're having right now, I'm recording this on the 13th of November, are, but I'm open to make a video on when the actual patch notes release, so they're not PTR notes anymore, but this is once I know that this is the patch that I'm actually playing on. And also let me know if you like this video. If you think that Protoss is way too weak against Zerg, please write your thesis below. I might respond to that in an extra video because I find that type of stuff entertaining as well. So maybe some other people would also find that entertaining. So if you think specifically Protoss is too weak against Zerg, please write below why. And yeah, just let me know with examples. You can give me game examples. You can give overall scores between Hero and Cyril if you want. I don't really care. You just give me everything you have, and I might make an extra video on that either. With all of that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed it. This was supposed to be a more lighthearted video. See you guys next time. Bye bye.